There is also the 25% hit on Canadian-made vehicles, but again, there is a patchwork of carve-outs for U.S.-sourced parts. It's a lot of moving parts this morning. Megan Fitzpatrick is in Ottawa. She is going to be leading our coverage. Megan, walk us through the state of play.
Here is what Prime Minister Mark Carney is saying in a statement that he posted on social media last night. He writes that while the Canadian government is disappointed by this action, we remain committed to CUSMA, which is the world's second largest free trade agreement by trading volume.
Trump called it a gift to Americans. Canada called it a joke. On day one of his latest tariff stunt, Trump strutted in front of cameras, selling it as another masterstroke in his America First show. The target? Ottawa. The message? Fall in line, or pay the price. But instead of folding, Canada fired back. Within days, U.S. imports to Canada started shrinking. Tourism from the states plummeted 60%. And $29.8 billion worth of U.S. goods, steel, aluminum, even maple syrup, got slapped with retaliatory tariffs designed to sting. Trump wanted a public duel. Mark Carney gave him silence, and a strategy that quietly turned the tables. While Trump played to the crowd, Carney played the long game. And what happened next would send shockwaves across the border. Like this video, subscribe, and keep watching, because you're about to see how Canada refused to join his show. Trump's tariff announcement wasn't a policy. It was a performance. Cameras, slogans, applause lines. All the hallmarks of a political rally dressed up as economic strategy. He framed it as punishment for unfair trade, a bold stand for American workers. But underneath the rhetoric was a familiar pattern. Chaos first, consequences later. Canada didn't flinch. No grand speeches. No hashtags. Just a cold, calculated counterstrike.
Mr. Speaker, the American tariffs, the new tariffs on steel and aluminum, are unlawful, unjustified, and illogical. I agree with the member. And that is why one of the reasons why we have retaliatory tariffs on over $90 billion worth of U.S. goods. We are in intensive negotiations with the Americans and in parallel preparing reprisals if those negotiations do not succeed.
Within hours of the announcement, Ottawa moved to reduce U.S. imports across key sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and energy. The goal wasn't random retaliation. It was surgical. The first wave targeted industries where American exporters depended heavily on Canadian buyers, ensuring maximum disruption with minimal damage to Canada's own economy. Take Ontario's electricity exports. In a move that went almost unnoticed in the U.S. press, Ontario temporarily paused supply to certain American grids. For border states like Michigan and New York, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a warning shot. Canada could play hardball in sectors the U.S. rarely thinks about until the lights flicker. Then came the tourism gut punch. U.S. visitors are a lifeline for many Canadian towns. But Carney's government quietly made cross-border travel less attractive. Tighter visa processing, higher fees, fewer promotions. Within weeks, American tourism to Canada dropped by an astonishing 60%. That wasn't just lost hotel bookings and maple candy sales. It was a ripple hitting U.S. airlines, car rental companies, and cross-border retail. But the most direct hit was $29.8 billion in retaliatory tariffs. Steel, aluminum, maple syrup, the headline grabbers, were just the start. Behind the scenes, Canada targeted farm equipment, construction materials, and processed foods. Each item was chosen for its political geography. Ottawa wasn't just taxing goods, it was taxing votes. Michigan's auto parts? Hit. Iowa's agricultural exports? Hit. Pennsylvania's metals industry? Hit. These weren't random states. They were swing states, the electoral battlegrounds Trump needed for re-election. In Lansing, auto suppliers started calling emergency meetings. In Des Moines, farmers who'd once cheered Trump's tough trade talk were suddenly staring at canceled contracts. The backlash wasn't coming from pundits, it was coming from his own voter base. And here's the twist. Canada wasn't acting alone. While Trump's team scrambled to put out political fires, Carney was on the phone with European counterparts, Asian trade ministers, and Latin American allies. The message was consistent. Canada is open for business, without the drama. The contrast could not have been sharper. Trump's Japan trade deal was a perfect example of his style. Headline first, details later. He announced it as a win for American farmers. But buried in the fine print, Japanese automakers gained easier access to the U.S. market, undercutting American car manufacturers in the very states Trump claimed to protect. Carney studied those mistakes. He knew flashy announcements made for good TV, but terrible economics. Canada's agreements were quieter, smaller in scope, but airtight in enforcement. No vague promises, no legal loopholes, just contracts that could be enforced in court. This wasn't about winning the news cycle. It was about building leverage brick by brick. By cutting dependence on U.S. supply chains and replacing American imports with European and Asian alternatives, Canada was laying the groundwork for an economy that could withstand, and even thrive under, prolonged trade hostility from Washington. Trump's camp tried to spin the situation. They accused Canada of overreacting, called Carney weak, and hinted at even higher tariffs. But the numbers told a different story. U.S. export volumes to Canada were dropping faster than to any other top trading partner. Meanwhile, Canada's trade deficit with the U.S. was shrinking, not because they were importing less overall, but because they were importing smarter. American exporters started feeling the squeeze in unexpected ways. Small manufacturers in Ohio found their raw material costs climbing. Texas energy companies lost contracts to Norwegian and Qatari suppliers. Even the maple syrup joke, a favorite of cable news pundits, had a sting. Vermont's syrup producers, who relied on Canadian bottling plants, suddenly faced higher costs and delayed shipments. But that wasn't the whole story. While Trump doubled down on his showman routine, Canada was setting the stage for something much bigger, a long-term rewrite of trade rules that would make Ottawa less vulnerable to any future tariff tantrum from Washington. And that next phase? It was where Carney's real genius came into play. Mark Carney's strategy wasn't just retaliation, it was insulation. Every move Canada made was designed to reduce the shock of future U.S. trade aggression. Trump's tariffs were treated not as a crisis, but as a stress test for the Canadian economy. And Carney passed it with quiet precision. The first pillar of his plan, diversify. Instead of begging Washington for exemptions, Canada doubled down on alternative suppliers and buyers. Grain imports once sourced from the U.S. were replaced with shipments from Argentina and Australia. Industrial components came from Germany, not Michigan. Even energy contracts, traditionally dominated by U.S. pipelines, were shifted toward LNG deals with Qatar and coastal terminals in British Columbia aimed at shipping to Asia. Every switch sent a message. The U.S. is no longer Canada's default partner. Trump's tariffs, meant to force Ottawa into concessions, ended up accelerating Canada's independence. And unlike Trump's rapid-fire press releases, these deals were negotiated behind closed doors, announced only when the ink was dry and the terms enforceable. The second pillar, precision targeting of U.S. vulnerabilities. Carney knew that tariffs alone wouldn't force a policy change in Washington. But if those tariffs hit the right industries in the right places, they could trigger pressure from within Trump's own political base. Ottawa's retaliatory list was a map of electoral pain points. In Michigan, auto suppliers that depended on Canadian parts saw production delays and rising costs. In Wisconsin, dairy exporters lost access to premium Canadian markets. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, steel and aluminum plants faced new competition from imports redirected through Canada's EU and UK agreements, deals the US had no part in. Local business owners weren't just angry, they were calling their representatives, demanding relief. And for Trump, that meant the backlash was no longer abstract. It was in his voter math. The third pillar, control the narrative without joining the show. Trump's style thrived on conflict in front of cameras. Every opponent who played along, who argued with him in sound bites, ended up feeding his momentum. Carney refused to give him that stage. Canada's retaliatory measures were explained in technical press releases, not political theater. When asked about Trump's insults, Carney gave measured, almost boring responses. It was strategic boredom, the kind that denied Trump the televised brawl he wanted. This approach made Ottawa look calm, competent, and, in the eyes of other trade partners, reliable. While Washington was tied up in tariff fights with multiple countries at once, Canada was locking in new deals. EU imports surged, Asian markets expanded, and American exporters watched as competitors filled the gaps they once dominated. Trump's mistake was underestimating how globalized supply chains work. His assumption was that Canada, so integrated with the US economy, couldn't afford to break away. But Carney flipped that logic. By building multiple smaller trade relationships instead of one dominant dependency, Canada created redundancy, the kind of economic shock absorbers that made Trump's pressure tactics far less effective. The economic data told the story. Within months, Canada's non-US exports rose sharply, offsetting much of the loss from US trade. Manufacturing output held steady. The Canadian dollar, instead of collapsing under tariff pressure, stabilized as investor confidence grew. Meanwhile, US industries targeted by Ottawa saw profit warnings pile up. Then came the symbolic blow. The US floated the idea of an EU-style comprehensive deal, positioning it as a way to reset relations. But buried in the proposal were clauses that heavily favored American dispute mechanisms and limited Canada's ability to form independent trade agreements. Carney rejected it outright. Not with an angry speech, not with a headline-grabbing press conference. Just a firm, public no, paired with a clear explanation that Canada would not sign away its strategic flexibility. That refusal became a turning point. It wasn't just about tariffs anymore, it was about control. Trump wanted a deal that looked balanced on paper, but tilted power back to Washington. Carney saw through it and called the bluff. In doing so, he signaled to the world that Canada wasn't playing defense anymore. It was dictating its own trade terms. And the world noticed. Countries burned by US trade fights, from Brazil to South Korea, began sending delegations to Ottawa, not just for business, but for lessons. Carney's mix of targeted retaliation, supply chain diversification, and narrative discipline was suddenly a model for surviving and thriving in the age of tariff wars. By the time Trump realized how far the damage had spread, it was too late. Canada's market share in several sectors had been permanently replaced by other partners. The US was no longer the automatic first call for Canadian importers or exporters. And the voters in his own base, especially in swing states, were starting to connect their lost contracts and rising costs back to his gift to Americans. This was the quiet victory. No dramatic surrender, no televised handshake. Just a slow, steady shift in economic gravity, away from Washington toward Ottawa and its chosen partners. Trump had set out to corner Canada. Instead, he'd forced it to reinvent its trade map in ways that weakened US leverage for years to come. Trump thought he was writing the script, but Canada refused to read his lines. By cutting US imports, targeting swing state industries, and refusing that EU-style trap, Mark Carney didn't just survive the tariff war. He rewrote the rules. This wasn't a one-off skirmish. It was the start of a new trade era where Canada calls its own shots, and Washington's threats don't land the same way they used to. The question now is simple. If Canada can outmaneuver the world's largest economy without firing a shot, what happens when others follow the same playbook? If you think this was a masterclass in strategic retaliation, hit the like button, subscribe for more hard-hitting geopolitical breakdowns, and drop a comment. Did Trump just hand Canada the upper hand for good? Because this trade war isn't over, and the next round could be even bigger.